Hi there, I'm Adela, and welcome to the Podcast Brunch Club podcast. Today's episode is a roundup about the freedom of speech listening list that PBC members worldwide listened to in September. This is like book club, but for podcasts, and you can find the playlist at podcastbrunchclub.com/freedom of speech. And today, I'm joined by Paul Kondo, who curated the list for us this month. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Adela. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So listeners, as you know, today we'll talk a little bit about the Freedom of Speech playlist, and then we'll get to some podcast recommendations from Paul and from the PBC community. But before we get into the discussion, Paul, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do in the podcast space?
Sure. I have the Podcast Gumbo newsletter, which I've been writing for about 2.5 years, where I recommend podcast episodes every week. And then at the beginning of this year, I started the Podcast Gumbo podcast, which is a little different. They're short episodes where I ask guests to inquire about a national day, and I find an episode related to that. So you had done one back in, I think, March. It was Manatee Appreciation Day, I believe.
Yeah. I wanted to give you a really tough one.
There you go.
So what he does is he sends everybody a list of like the national days that are, he assigns everybody to a week, and then he gives them a list of like, these are all the national days that are happening during that week. Pick one of them and tell me what it is. And then his challenge is to then go and find an episode, or it's an episode, right?
Yes.
A specific episode about that topic. And so like there's all sorts of random National Appreciation Days or International Appreciation Days. I think like I saw National Pencil Appreciation Day, like National John Appreciation, like John, the name John, nice, or something. Like, I don't know. Yeah. So I kind of wanted to pick one that was like going to be interesting, but also hard for you, because I know that you are, you know, like a wizard in the podcast exploration.
It is hard.
Yeah,
it is hard to find some of these. Trust me.
Yeah. Yeah. But you did a great job. And your podcast episodes are only like 5 minutes.
Yeah, less than 5 minutes. I want to keep them short just because I don't think that they deserve anything longer than that. So,
so just search Podcast Gumbo, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the Freedom of Speech playlist that you curated. First, let me give a brief overview of the episodes that we listened to those listeners who haven't looked at the playlist yet or listened. So we listened to an episode of Shaping Opinion. The episode title was The First Amendment, 45 Words That Shaped America. And it's an interview that delves into how the First Amendment shaped America. The second episode we listened to was from the podcast Unprecedented, and the episode was called Middle Finger to God. And it was about the Westboro Baptist Church and how they have sort of some of their freedom of speech activities have brought on extreme distress, and it resulted in a U.S. Supreme Court decision. The next episode was from the Freedom of Speech Coalition's podcast, which is based out of New Zealand, and it was called What is the Maori Position on Free Speech? And it's a discussion on the Maori position on free speech. The next episode was Come Through with Rebecca Carroll, and the episode title was Walter Mosley Believes in Freedom of Speech, period. And it's an interview with Walter Mosley, who was called into HR when he used the N-word to tell a story about something that happened to him. He then quit the job and wrote an opinion piece entitled Why I Quit the Writer's Room that was in the New York Times. And finally, an episode from The Compass from BBC World Service. And the episode title was Journalists, Free Speech versus Personal Safety. And journalists often face a tough choice, exercise their right to free speech and freedom of the press, or risk their own personal safety. So this episode talks to a bunch of journalists all over the world and about their struggles and their work. So, Paul, tell us a little bit about why you chose the theme and how you went about choosing the episodes for the list.
Yeah, so I actually had put together just a whole bunch of episodes, and my theme wasn't very strong, let's say, kindly put it. But one of the ones that was, one of the podcasts that was on the list was the Walter Mosley interview. And that is, favorite is a kind of a hard word to use for that episode, but it certainly struck me and immediately struck me as something that I would probably listen to over and over again over time, because it's just so powerful. And so I thought about that and what I could use sort of around that. And I had also listened a couple months ago to the Unprecedented podcast, Middle Finger to God. And certainly there is similarities to those around freedom of speech. So then I just realized, let me just build it around those two. And I found the Shaping Opinion episode. I've been familiar, and I've actually been interviewed on the Shaping Opinion podcast. And so I knew that show. So I want to give really a grounding towards what freedom of speech is, because that's the thing, is it's so complex, and your mind may think about one thing and your heart and your emotions kind of make you think differently or feel differently. And that's why it's such a difficult topic for many people. And also it's just a little complicated to understand sometimes, because you think it's one thing, it's really not. And then I know that, we in the US don't really think internationally a lot of times. And, we want to get a different perspective there. And then the last one, the one with the journalist, I actually didn't pick that.
Mm-hmm. I add that. I added that one.
So yeah.
So Paul put together a really great list of 4 episodes that he submitted, and I was like, oh, these are great. And I just wanted to find. We had room in the list. I limit it to 5, but I really wanted to get more international. I know that the New Zealand episode focused on the Maori position. But I figured, I was like, well, we have room. Let's see if I can find something else that fits. And so that's where I found that episode. And they actually it was a whole series of, I think, 5 episodes about freedom of speech taken from a different angle. And that was, I think, the 4th or 5th episode in that mini series. So I know that you attended a virtual podcast Brunch Club meeting. And just for those of you out there who don't know, we have chapters all over the world. We also have a global virtual chapter. And we've had that for a while, well before the coronavirus pandemic. And you can get on the invitation list by going to podcastbrunchclub.com/virtual-chapter. But anyway, Paul, so I know that you went to one of their meetings this past weekend. And I'm wondering, what was the conversation about?
So what's great about that chapter is that we had so many people that were from different countries. Mm-hmm. We had, if I remember correctly, we had somebody from Israel, China, Australia, and France, and of course multiple people from the U.S., but all over the U.S. North Dakota, I think, was there. Nice. So yeah, it's really interesting, and especially something like this that is very different in the rest of the world. This topic is so different that it was great to sort of hear different perspectives. About this.
Yeah. Were there any strong opinions?
I would say that although there were strong opinions, there were sort of interesting takes. Mm-hmm. So, for example, one person had said, well, what about my right to silence? Mm. And I was like, wow, I never really thought about it that way. So that was really an interesting way of looking at it, coming a different way. Maybe not surprisingly, one person, because that person was very religious, would not listen to the Middle Finger to God episode.
Is that based on the title? Was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I thought that was really compelling because of what this theme is about. And I think it really sort of speaks to the issues that people like sometimes, are immediately turned off by something. And I get it, right? It's like, that could be offensive to me. but there's a lot of things about speech that are offensive to a lot of people, but just because you don't agree with it doesn't necessarily mean like you don't want freedom of speech. Right.
And you could just choose not to listen. And that's what this person decided to do, is they just chose not to listen. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, obviously I'm oversimplifying the issue, but it's a good example or illustration of exactly like you're saying. It's sort of the theme at play, in a very meta way. Right. Yeah. It's actually, I mean, it's interesting to me that this person decided not to listen based on the title alone, especially because the reason that the episode was titled that is because this very, very, very religious person used that phrase in the episode. That phrase, middle finger to God, was used by the woman, Margie, I think is her name, Margie, whatever. I think so, yeah. Yeah. And she's the one who's, the head or the spokesperson for the Westboro Baptist Church. So, yeah, that's an interesting twist too, is that phrase was used by somebody who considers themselves very religious. Yeah. So did you have any takeaways about the episodes? Like, what were your sort of main takeaways?
Like I said, the first one that really stood out to me was the Rebecca Carroll episode with Walter Mosley. And boy, that was really tough but I really found it interesting because Rebecca Carroll, I felt, wasn't really understanding Walter Mosley's point.
Totally. Oh my God. Right. I could not. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And it's not easy, right? He has his viewpoint and he states it very clearly, but it's very uncomfortable, right? Because people don't want to use the N-word. And, I'll say it, like I was surprised because when I was asked to sort of talk about, in the chapter meeting about why I picked the ones that I did, I went through it and I actually used the N-word, not the softened N-word, but I used, and I was just like, could I actually do that? Could I say that word? Because it's just so ingrained as something you just don't say. Yeah. And I said it because this is exactly what Walter Mosley is saying, right? It's like, why are you softening? And why I would say it is because I couldn't say this is about the N-word, using the N-word versus using the N-word. Yeah. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So, I want to be true to my beliefs to Walter Mosley, but it's still so hard to say, the word. So,
and like, it's not our word to say, right? Like, I feel like some people own the word and that's their prerogative to use it, and some people don't. And I wouldn't feel comfortable. It's the same, I think that there's a generation of people who feel that way about the word queer, I mean, you're talking about an older generation of people who, like, that was a very, very insulting word to use. And like, I know somebody who had a conversation with her father about it, and she said, you need to call me queer. And he was like, no way. I'm not. That's like calling my daughter something like really derogatory in his mind. And so there's definitely some, I don't know. I mean, that's a whole episode probably, or a whole discussion about language, and the use of language.
Correct.
Which we've actually done in the past, but it'd be fun to go back and do like a language 2.0 discussion, because there's so much to talk about language, but.
Right. And I think about like there's sort of ignorance, and there's maybe willful ignorance, right? So in that episode, they talk about the older woman from, I think she was from California, right? Yeah. And that story when she just happened to use the word boys, and, one of them was so offended by that, and she had no idea. And, honestly, this is like, could I find myself using that word? Sure. Like, because, and then you realize, like, you know, education obviously is the biggest part of all of this.
But I think you're right. Like the thing so I enjoyed the episode, and like, to be fair, like for me, a really good playlist is not a playlist that has only episodes that I really like, right? A good playlist is a playlist that makes me really think or gets me riled up in some way. Like either I'm like, yeah, or I'm like, no, or, you know, I'm crying or I'm laughing. Like so it doesn't necessarily have to mean that I like every single episode. It's just something that gets me thinking and it moves me in some way, right? And I will say that in that exact vein, I did not like that episode because I felt like she was being obtuse. Like she was just, or either purposely or not purposely. Like either way, I felt like she was just she was unwilling to come at the question from a different angle or for putting herself in somebody else's shoes, which, you know, it just bothered me. Like the whole, like, she just completely dismissed that woman, you know, for the listeners who haven't listened to this episode, there was a little sort of side story that he told about, he was young and he was kind of cleaning some space. He was with a bunch of young black men. And this was back in the, I don't know, 70s, maybe? I don't know. But a while ago, 80s, maybe. I don't know, he's probably in his 50s or 60s now. So, maybe in the 60s. And then this older woman, this is in California, just kind of approaches them. And she's like so excited to see them. She's got a big smile on her face. And she's like, I'm so happy to see you boys here. And one of the young men who grew up in the South, you know, boy is a very derogatory term when you're talking to a young black person or a black man at all, I think. And he almost like ripped into her. They apparently like had to really hold him back. And she was like, she didn't, you know, Rebecca Carroll was sort of like, she didn't know that boy was, right. And I was like, well, she sort of just was completely unwilling to put herself in somebody else's shoes, which is just like what she sort of wants other people to do, right? She wants other people to be able to put themselves in her shoes or anybody else's shoes, but she seemed very unwilling to try and put herself in other people's shoes. And I don't know, it's very fraught. It's a hard conversation. And I know that her background is different. She said up front that she was adopted by white parents. So she's a black woman who's adopted by white parents. And she has a really difficult relationship with the N-word. But yeah, there was something about the way that it just seemed like that they were completely talking on different levels, you know? And I understood Walter Mosley very, like, I completely agreed with everything he was saying. And I couldn't understand why Rebecca Carroll was just like not connecting with him at all on it.
Well, I kind of actually see that, right? Is like from a sort of intellectual standpoint, right? You have to think about it. Do you agree with Walter Mosley or not, right? But then there's the emotional side. And I can completely agree with Rebecca Carroll. Mm-hmm. And so that's the thing. Is like internally, for every person internally, how do they feel and how do they react? Do they react from the sort of the intellectual side, and maybe that's a wrong word, versus your emotional side? Yeah. And in that episode, I think that brings that out, and you see both sides. It's almost like, yes, I get them both.
I see.
You know.
Yeah.
But yes, it was very interesting for her. I didn't feel also is that she was getting it, or getting what he was saying. She still had her viewpoint, and she wanted to get that across.
Yeah. There were a couple of points in that episode too where I was like, I don't know. I think she said something like, you were the only black person in that room, right? And he was like, no, there were other people. And she's like, well, multiple sources said that you were the only black person in that room. And he's like, but I was in the room and I know. Like I'm the source, so there was even just that kind of thing where I'm just like, I mean, he's literally sitting in front of you. He is the ultimate source, and you seem to not be believing him. So Yeah, that one sort of, yeah. I mean, again, in a good way, like in a way that I'm glad it was on the list because it gives a lot of, a great podcast brunch club list is one that gives a lot of fodder for discussion. And I definitely think this one did.
Right. And I think the same thing with the middle finger to God. Boy,
Totally.
I have such reactions to Westboro,
Mhm.
right? It's like, oh my gosh, they do such horrible, horrible things.
Yeah.
But, even at the end, right, there's sort of a bit of a twist at the end. And
Yes.
like, oof, wow, okay. It's like, can I agree with this Supreme Court decision? As much as emotionally I don't want to, it is right. It is right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It was a really good episode. And again, in the same way, like didn't, I don't seek out kind of controversial episodes like that, but that one really got me thinking.
yeah.
So let me I like to, as much as possible, give voice to the Podcast Brunch Club community on these episodes. So I asked a question on the Podcast Brunch Club Facebook group about if anybody had any strong opinions, positive or negative, about any of the episodes on the Freedom of Speech listening list. And I'm just going to read a couple of them. So one person said, I found the Shaping Opinion episode to be overly long and dry. Okay. Somebody else said, this was an excellent list. The Middle Finger to God episode actually had me rethinking some things. Actually, so did the Walter Mosley one. And I learned a good bit in the Shaping Opinion episode. She says, working in media and being involved in platform decisions when receiving content complaints, this stuff especially hits home. And I kind of ended up with a different perspective than I had before. She's still pondering it. And then somebody else said, who I think this person is from Canada. So he says, I find the freedom of speech argument to be boring and pedantic. It's only really a big issue with Yanks as well. Most other nations seem to prioritize more crucial political issues. So, yeah, so I just wanted to bring those kind of, again, the comments from the Podcast Brunch Club community into the PBC podcast.
Now, if I can stop you there for a
Sure.
sec? Were you at the meeting with Eric Jones?
I was.
So Jenna, she had told me about what Eric had mentioned about freedom of speech in Germany. I wasn't on that call, but it was as that in Germany you're not allowed to talk about the Holocaust. Is that what he said?
We had so I was on a different virtual podcast brunch club meeting than you were. By the way, for any listeners out there, the most international of the Podcast Brunch Club meetings any given month, the virtual ones, is the one that happens on Saturday morning in the U.S. So the Saturday, I think 9 a.m. Eastern time, just because I think that hits at the most time zones that are, relevant for people in China and Europe and stuff. And I was on the Friday call, which tends to be a bit more U.S., but not terribly. But we did have Barbara, who is in Germany, and she's part of our London chapter, but she's in Germany now during the virus. And she talked a little bit about, and I can't remember who exactly talked about what part of it, but she did talk about how Germany, there was a law, I think, that you can't deny the Holocaust. It's not that you can't talk about it. I think that you can't deny that it happened.
Got it.
But there is an episode on the bonus list. If you go to the podcastbrunchclub.com/freedom of speech list, there at the bottom, there's like sort of bonus episodes if you want to dig a little deeper. And there's an episode about Poland. And Poland just recently, I want to say in the last, few years, has instituted a rule that you are not allowed to talk about Poland's participation in a negative way in World War II and in the Holocaust and the concentration camps. So there's a really good episode. I think it's from On the Media about that. So, yeah. But Eric Jones also has a newsletter. I'll shout it out. It's called Hurt Your Brain. So I think it's just search Hurt Your Brain newsletter, Eric Jones, Eric with a K. And he does a really great job of synthesizing educational content on the internet. Like, it's not just podcasts. He does do a lot of podcast listening, and he puts forth a lot of podcast recommendations, but he also watches YouTube and reads and stuff. So it's a really great way to just learn. So let's just take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about our podcast picks this month.
Great.
I'm Mitzi Miller, host of 70 Million, an open source podcast from Lantigua Williams & Co. that documents criminal justice reform, one story at a time. This season, we'll look at pressure points along the carceral matrix where change or collapse seems certain. Areas like the impact of COVID-19, facial recognition technology, voting from jail, and other pressing realities. Find episodes, annotated transcripts, and more at 70millionpod.com and hear us everywhere you listen to podcasts.
And we're back. So, Paul, what podcasts are you recommending to people lately?
So I've got myself into a little bit of trouble lately because I'm always looking for something new in my newsletter. I have to listen to a lot of stuff. And somehow in the last couple of weeks, I've started two series, which I rarely do because I just don't have the time to do that. Mm-hmm. So there's one that is, it's kind of weird because it doesn't seem like it would be light and enjoyable. That seems like a weird word to say, but it's called, the podcast is called Mr. 80%, and it talks about a man who has prostate cancer. And yet it's a really compelling, it's just really sort of likable. It's easy to listen to, and, to hear his stories of how he's dealt with it, dealt with how it affects his family. It's they dropped the first 3 episodes, which also helps me, and they're not that long. I think they're about 25 minutes long, so you can sort of get through them quickly. But they dropped like 3 the first day, so immediately I could jump in and listen to 3 and really get in. So that was a nice find. I don't even know how I heard about it. And then the other one, big sort of series, is the new Driving the Green Book.
Okay.
So that actually we had seen, well, maybe you weren't there, at Sound Education last year, one of the closing keynotes talked about this podcast. And so it's 2 people that are driving from Detroit to New Orleans. And it talks about the Green Book. Yes. And I don't know if you've seen the movie, which I actually have not seen the movie. And now I'm wondering, should I see the movie or not? Or should I wait? Or should I not even worry about it, given that there's this, podcast out there? So they have interviews with people, and just thinking about, that era and not being a Black person and what they had to go through and why they needed a Green Book. I mean, it is hard to fathom, at the base level. Yeah. But, so that's a fantastic, new podcast.
Very good. I will link to those in the show notes. Yeah, so I don't actually have any recommendations this month, but I do, again, want to give a shout out to our Podcast Brunch Club Facebook group community. So I will often pose a question on the Facebook group, just asking what podcasts people have discovered lately and what they're about. So let me go through some of those. So Isaac said, I've been getting super into the Bible Project. The casual style makes complex topics super approachable and easy to listen to. Definitely a current favorite. Okay, so here's another one. Stephanie recommends Real Ass Affirmations. It's a hilarious, fiery, short podcast with some good advice that we all know deep down inside, but need a little kick in the ass to remind us of. She says she loves it. And Naomi recommends her own podcast, which is called Meet Cute, 15-minute scripted rom-com stories to escape into, and they publish 4 times a week. Kelly is said that she's listening to season 7 of Uncover, Dead Wrong, and she said it's about a man who is falsely accused of murder and the absolute travesty of justice that follows. She was absolutely shocked. She says it was troubling and revealing. And finally, Ashley recommends Unjust and Unsolved. Journalist Maggie Freeling tells a different story every week about a person who is convicted of a crime they possibly did not commit. It's pretty early on in their run, but I think it's really good and interesting so far. Any of those ring bells for you?
The names sound familiar, but I don't think they've been in my queue now.
Yeah.
My queue is already long enough, but certainly I will get some of these in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's always interesting to think about how I discover a podcast. Sometimes I find a podcast and I love it. And I'm like, how did I find out about that? Because I want to go back to that source over and over again. Correct. So that I could be like, I like that as a I don't know, curator of good podcasts. I want to go back to that source and I can't remember. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's it for this episode. Our theme in September is navigating uncertainty, and you'll be able to find that list at podcastbrunchclub.com/uncertainty. You can find out how to join us at our worldwide meetings at podcastbrunchclub.com. Thanks, and happy listening. Thank you for listening and being a part of the Podcast Brunch Club community. Do you have any thoughts on our discussion this month? Send a message or voice memo to podcast@podcastbrunchclub.com. PBC is a passion project, and we rely on support from our global community to continue bringing people together in person and online. So if you feel like PBC has contributed to your life in any way, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Go to podcastbrunchclub.com/support for more information. If you're interested in becoming an organizational partner, go to podcastbrunchclub.com/sponsors. A quick thanks to our early partners, Podbean. For 1 free month of podcast hosting, go to podbean.com/PBC. Podchaser, the IMDb of podcasts. Listen Notes, a podcast search engine. Critical Frequency, the podcast network for everyone else. The Venn Media, a weekly newsletter for curious minds. And Lantigua Williams and Company, podcast network, telling stories in the seams of society. Finally, some credits for this episode. Katie DeFiore is our audio editor. Music is from Chad Crouch and Misael Ghana, downloaded from Free Music Archive. I'm Adela, founder of Podcast Brunch Club, and as always, thanks and happy listening.